Hello, how are you all doing? We are officially in week 3. I want to give you a few reminders. I am turning in enrollment verification on tomorrow. So if I have not received an email from you, if I have not received any work from you, then unfortunately you will be marked as not having been present up to this point in this semester, because I have sent out several emails. So I am also going to send out another one on tonight. Today is Wednesday, September 5th. Because it's Friday, everything is due. So just be mindful of that. I also have given you all an extra week up until this point to turn in all of your assignments, because many of you had issues with books. The bookstore has run out of books. I mean, just a number of things. Some of you are waiting on your books to come in the mail. I've received emails. Thank you for those. I just want you to know that I am trying to work with you. So as long as you work with me, I'm working with you. We're going to make sure that as long as everybody does what they need to do and we learn what we need to learn, we good. I'm not that kind of stickler. So I want you all to be aware of that. For those of you who are still not clear on why there are 2 different due dates, the first due date, the nearest due date, is the date that your work is actually due. There is another due date that is further towards the end of the semester. Usually it will read December 2nd. If you see December 2nd, it means that is the day that the portal closes. It means that I am giving you grace, that even if you do not turn your work in on time, you are still able to turn it in late, so that you don't just completely destroy your grade. But once the portal closes, it closes. And so if December 2nd is not the second far off date, then that means the portal closes earlier than that. So for your welcome week assignment, the portal closes on this Sunday, September 9th. Because if you ain't done welcome week by then, you're probably not going to do it. Okay? So that's my logic and my rationale. I'm also not going to keep going back and reading all of those old assignments, because we're continuing to matriculate through the semester. And so the goal is for us to be able to keep up where we are. And I have several students this semester, so I do not have the luxury of giving that level of grace. So the nearest due date is your hard deadline. The second due date that you see is when the portal completely closes. All right, so this class, this session, we are talking about chapter 3 in your ethical theory book. For those of you who are using the book by Rachel's, the elements of moral responsibility, you will be looking at ethical egoism this week, which is what we're actually going to talk about. So in Pajman's book, he calls it morality, self-interest, and future selves. Which is talking about the major question of why should a person be moral. John Hospers raises the question, why not shortchange a blind news vendor by telling him that he was paid with a $5 bill rather than a $1 bill? The question being that he's not going to know the difference. And it's in your best interest to lie to the man. So if it's in your best interest, why not be immoral and lie and cheat the man out of his money? Because what does morality matter anyway? So we're begging the question of what it matters to be moral in the first place. And so we will be going through several answers, some that are highlighted in your book and some that have not been, some that we've touched on in previous chapters, and some that we've not even gotten to yet. But I do want to try to expand upon the full scope of the why, because you have several philosophers who have gone to the lengths of trying to include it, and also including it by using different types of rationale for it. Okay, so for those of you who are taking notes, the first one that we are going to discuss, and I said for those of you, but my hope is that all of you, whenever you sit down with your lecture videos and watch these, have a pen and paper handy. Not even just this one, but any of the other links to videos that are included in your unit, because this information is for you. So please do take notes, please do be thorough, and please do review them, and not just when we get to midterms, but throughout the semester. That way your knowledge is able to build upon what we discussed and learned about the previous week. So there are several reasons why people feel that we should be moral. And unfortunately, in our community, in the Black community, most of us are raised in Christocentric households, meaning that our parents, grandparents, or whoever raised us subscribe to Christianity. So religion is oftentimes the first vantage point that we have of what morality looks like, and it's the why we're given in terms of why we should apply ethics to our life and why we should behave morally and do good and righteous things, if you will. And so the first answer is the answer of the divine command, because God told us to. God told us to be good people. God told us don't lie. God told us don't cheat. God told us don't steal. God gave us the whole 10 commandments through Moses. Okay? And so this is called an ad baculum argument. And it basically is saying that God is going to punish you or reward you based on the type of choices that you make. And this is the idea that there are no rewards in the world for doing good things, that nice guys actually finish last. But perhaps there may be another way for us to look at it. There's an egoistic answer that says that if God is going to reward us, then that's an incentive to us, that's in our favor. But just because something is an incentive to us doesn't make it a good reason. So it's still incumbent upon us to figure out why that's a good reason. And when we're looking at the logic of it, that reason is an appeal to power. So when we're talking about logic and reasoning and where they come from and naming them, that is a part of critical thinking. So for those of you who have already taken critical thinking, this should sound familiar. For those of you who have not yet taken critical thinking, these are different types of reasoning that you will learn about over that course. But they go hand in hand, because a lot of times how we make our decisions and how we rationalize why we make the decisions that we make are directly connected to our critical thinking and the different appeals and leaps that we make for the sake of our own case, especially when the burden of proof rests on us. So, because God is going to reward us, it's a good reason to do what God said, or to follow or answer the divine command. And so we wouldn't say that God commands it because it's good. We would like to say that whatever it is that we're thinking about is good because God commands it. That's how we're often taught. God wouldn't tell us to do something that's not necessarily good. So it has to be good because God said so. So here we're going back into the logic. But then that begs the question of how can you tell whether or not God is a good God? And then you begin to look at your biblical stories and then begin to use critical thinking to deduce a conclusion about that. Okay? Now mind you, the Bible is a library. It's not a book. So in the library of the Bible, there are 66 books that all give us different pictures, perceptions, and stories about who God is. Not only in the lives of those characters, but also how that can be depicted and recognized in our own lives. So depending on who you're talking to and depending on which book in the Bible they're reading or which character or stories they're applying this to, you might very well get different answers about how people have assumed or come to the conclusion that God is good or is not. And so the unfortunate thing about the answer of the divine command is that it still applies even if God has not been considered a good God. That's something to sit and wrestle with for a minute. Because if we're still supposed to do it because God said so, but God is not necessarily a good God, then what kind of person does that make us if we follow a God that's not good? And what does that say about our actions as well? But if God said so and we're going to be punished or rewarded based on these things, then it's simply a matter of us responding in obedience. And not with any critical thinking, foresight, or free will included. Unless we completely submit our free will to what, quote unquote, the will of God is, or what God commands. So there's a lot of slippery slopes in there that you have to be aware of in terms of the logic and the rationale that people can use to attempt to apply this reasoning. But it's one. So the next one in this argument of the divine command is that we obey God because we love God. And God should be loved. But obedience has to be questioned of whether it is done from fear or whether God's love or the love that we have for God needs to be justified. If the love that we have for God needs to be justified, then it makes sense that we would need to display actions in order to prove said love. And if we fear God, then it makes sense that we would need to perform certain actions that exhibit said fear. But then if we look at this in the analogy of parents and children and obedience and doing the right thing or not doing the right thing, then the question is, how do we get children to obey what's right or wrong? Do we do it by making them fear us? Or is it possible for them to be obedient children in the name of love alone? And this is a very hard conversation in our communities because a lot of our parents grew up under the guise of fearing God. And the only way to get your children to respect and obey you is to get your children to fear you too. And what that has yielded is a lot of abusive and unproductive discipline in the name of obedience. And so what I hope is that we are able to think critically about these things so that we can name them and assess them in their place in our own lives. Because mental health is a real thing. And it's very important for us to be aware of our mental health, to be aware of our experiences, and to be aware of how our experiences have had an effect on or have shaped our mental health. And so it's my hope that you are thinking very critically about this and what it means in your life. And the last one, when we're looking at the divine command, is the creation argument. Is that we owe our existence to God. And this consideration still does not establish whether or not God is a good God. So even though God created us, and because God created us, we owe our entire being back to God. Could the God that created us still not be a good God, thus causing us to obey not good commandments? And if that's the case, then we have to look at whether or not there are any missing premises or anything else that we have failed to consider when we are rationalizing through this argument. But when we look at the creation theory, it looks at coherence of truth as a form of reasoning. And so if we add the two premises together, premise A plus B equals premise C, then we could deduce that if God created us and we owe our existence to God, then therefore we should do as God commands. Okay? By critical thinking standards, that is a sound argument. But if we are still considering whether or not we answer divine commands based on what is being told to us, and whether what is being told to us is morale or not, then it doesn't matter who's telling us or what we owe to them, theoretically speaking. So that's why be moral if we are looking at answering by divine command. All right? Why be moral? Answer number 2. Because morality pays. Self-interest, and the things that we have to gain temporarily and finitely by moving in our own best interest. Some people will say it's selfish. Some people will say it's smart. Regardless of how it is characterized or depicted, it is still a way of being able to make moral decisions about how we should conduct ourselves. Okay? So self-interest as an answer presupposes that it is the nature of the world that cheaters will get caught and that good people will be rewarded. So, it's in your self-interest to always do the right thing. But we know that that is not the case, okay? So again, when we first started talking about the answer of the divine command, it brings back into question this. I don't know if it's a myth or if it's just a well-known thesis. We'll call it a well-known thesis. It's a well-known thesis that nice guys finish last. Okay? So to some people, the more you do the right thing, the less you receive in return for it. Or maybe you don't receive anything for it. Maybe there is no correlation or correspondence to it. Maybe they're just completely two different things. But the world does not correspond with the belief that cheaters will always get caught and people who do good will always be rewarded for doing good. Okay? The argument is faulty because of the correspondence theory of truth, that these two are related. And they're not. Observation and experience falsify any empirical statements. And so when we look at this, apart from natural law, okay, and I say natural law, looking at the laws of the universe, that you reap what you sow, that karma is actually a real thing, that if you do good, good will come back to you, and if you do evil or negative, or if you sow seeds of discord, they will too come back to you, okay? Outside of that understanding, there is nothing ethically that legislates that this is actually a sound argument. Plato looked at it through the eyes of the Socratic paradox. And what he said was that happiness has to do with the inner state of your soul and not what people think or what they do. And so you almost have this balancing act where there are some different thoughts that are brought to question. Okay? What is just? What is not just? That you should do what's right regardless of how it affects your life or death. That your whole life should be spent on the improvement of your soul, and an unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, all of this is Socrates. He believed this, and it is keenly illustrated throughout all of his writings. However, the paradox that exists is that people will act immorally, but they will not do so deliberately, and they're slightly incompatible with each other. Okay, Socrates and Plato were both very big on virtue ethics. And so this connotation or this notion of being able to rationalize and thus being a virtuous person because of it existed a lot in their work. But the outline of the Socratic paradox is that people seek what is of the greatest service to themselves. So if you know what's good, then you will always act in a good way to make good things happen. And if you act in such a way that is not conducive to your own good, then you must have been ignorant of what's good for you. Because if you know what's good for you, you will do what's good for you. If you act with knowledge, then you will get what is most serviceable to yourself. Okay? This is, again, this idea of virtue. But since no one knowingly harms himself, if it comes to you, then you acted in ignorance. Because we are responsible for what we know or for what we don't know. So if you are always responsible, then you're only going to do what's good for you, what's in your best interest. Anything else is the lack of knowing. Okay? And so ignorance is considered what is bad and what is evil and what is not useful in this case. And good is considered being knowledgeable. Knowledgeable is synonymous with virtue and good and value. So knowledgeable is good. Ignorance is bad. And when people do bad things, it is simply because they're ignorant. Not because they actually meant it. Because if you know better, you'll do better. Okay? I'm sure some of your mamas have said that before. I know mine did. So, in the end, you have Plato's attempt that fails because of people who are completely unconscious. You have some people who are completely in the dark. They're ignorant about all things, okay? Because to a great extent, every life that we live, we're ignorant until we're knowledgeable. And so for those who do not have the luxury of being able to amass knowledge and to be able to learn in different ways, they will always be at a disadvantage. So does this mean that the entirety of their lives is worthless? According to Plato, absolutely. Because they have nothing to contribute to the world. because they do not have the knowledge to be able to do so in a serviceable way. And if you cannot give it to yourself, you cannot give it to others. So here we can conclude that morality is not a sufficient condition for happiness, because our happiness is totally independent of external factors that are beyond our own control. Sometimes whether or not you can receive education, knowledge, guidance, wisdom is completely beyond your control, especially since we are born as babes and then we must matriculate in our own growth and development, which is a very important thing, because they talk often about what it means to be virtuous, but virtuous to them to a great extent was what it meant to be human. We talk about humanity as if we are born into it and not as if it is a state of development. And these philosophers knew that it was, and they treated it as such. So if you have not developed to a state of being virtuous, all is lost for you. It's because you're ignorant, essentially. And so when we recognize that there are factors beyond our own control that have effects on our lives, on our thoughts, and our feelings, and our perception, on the way that we see and we respond to things, then we know that happiness and knowledge, they're connected to morality, but they're not all contingent upon one another. Okay? Because that's the third question. And I guess I just kind of sideways answered it, but is morality a condition for happiness? And although it's more plausible, this view cannot account for all of the innocent victims in the world. Okay? So there are a lot of people who die every day because there are other people around them who are immoral. Doesn't mean that those people do not have the ability to have a happy life. And it does not mean that the morality that they lived was directly connected to their happy life. I think the best way that we can look at it at this point is that the more moral that we are, the greater happiness that exists for all people. But it can be a very different argument if we are looking at it in terms of the lens of individuality. Okay? Because our ability to agree on some common morals as a group is directly related to the well-being of the group. Okay? And there are different examples of how we can look at that and how we can work through it. So we've been through the answer of the divine command. We have worked through the answer of self-interest. The third answer for why we should be moral is so that we can play fair. So that we can hold at heart the common interests of all people. And we were just moving into it. Okay? So that's number 3, playing fair. And this is the understanding or the view that life is a game and all the games have rules. So it's to our mutual advantage and our common interest to play by the rules. And if everybody plays by the rules, then we know that we are at least on equal playing ground. Okay? This view is a variation of the philosophy to live and let live, to not try to control all things. And it's in your own interest and in the interest of all other people to obey the rules. Not just for you, but for your fellow man. Because our own immorality can have effects on other people. As we just explained. And when we look at this, we're now talking about contractarian ethics and social theories. We're talking about Locke and Hobbes and those guys. Because when we live in society, technically we do have social ethics that we abide by under the guise of law. So when we look at that, then we know that this view does hold that a group must obey the rules. As opposed to conducting themselves like anything goes. And I will say that this view of ethics is largely based on the fact that the rules will be equitably applied to all people, okay? Because even though we have law that is stated to be for all people, even though it appears that way, that is not exactly how it functions. And so you will see a disproportionate way that it is applied because it does not apply equitably to all people. Okay? So there are some objections that come up to the play fair argument. It is that sometimes you're better off by not following the rules because of what I just explained. It makes the assumption that there is equity in application. And so when there is not equity in application, sometimes you're better off doing your own thing. And so perhaps you prefer to be left alone, meaning that you would like to retreat from the system, or you would like to go off the grid. You want to do your own thing. You don't want nobody to bother you. You don't want anybody to try to cause you to live contrary to what you choose for yourself. And then you can just look at the rules and say, I don't have an issue abiding by the rules, but I need different rules because the ones that are presently being applied are not fair. They're not just. And that's a stance of self-worth, because essentially what you're declaring is that you deserve more. I deserve more than what the system is able to offer me. I don't desire to be a part of it, because I am being disenfranchised in the process, at which point you are now acting in your own self-interest. And so this is important. A lot of times we lose sight of our own goals because the rules become an end in themselves. The goal is just to follow the rules. It's not to live our dreams. And so we always have to be mindful of how to do our duty to society in conjunction with doing our duty to ourselves. Okay? And we've got to figure out which one is more important, which one takes precedence, and when, because it's not always going to be the same. Okay? So that's number 3, the play fair or the common interest answer. The next one is that we should engage in morality, or we should engage in ethical behavior simply because it is right. Okay? It's a priority statement. We should be ethical because it is right. It doesn't matter what the act will cost us or what we will have to pay because of it. Okay? So this view holds that we should act ethically because we are ethical people. It's not based on anything else. Okay? Rightness in and of itself is the motive for morality. I only want to be ethical because I want to be right. I want to be able to say that I took the high road. I want to be able to govern myself above reproach, meaning that I don't want to be in a position for anybody else to scrutinize my actions where it displays or reflects upon my character or my reputation in a negative way. Okay? Very, very personal. And so, in this case, it is important for us to distinguish reasons from motives. Reasons being our intention, and motives being our causes. Okay? So if this distinction is not familiar to you, another way to look at it would be in terms of looking at the difference between an argument and an explanation. Because a lot of times we use words that are very similar, that we think they're automatically synonymous, and they're not. Okay? Move around a little bit. My legs starting to go to sleep. So the question is, how do you get a morally irrational person to be able to understand this argument that they should do something because it's right? So if we can show that we have the knowledge of what is right, then we also can show that we have a basis of morality. If we cannot, then we arbitrarily show that ethics and morality are relative and they cannot be objective. Relative meaning that it will change from person to person, as we discussed last week when we were looking at the difference between objectivism and relativism. So a major goal of the course is to attempt to develop an ethical theory as the basis of morality and figuring out what that is. So when we ask the question of why should people be moral in general, we are begging the question of justification for the institution of morality. Why do we need an establishment that tells us how we should govern ourselves? But when we ask the question about why we as individuals, why should I be moral? Why should I conduct myself in a way that is considered righteous, ethical, moral? And that's an appeal to our personal interests. And that is relative, because